Today we're going to share communion together, so get ready for that in your mind, if you would, please. We'll finish our worship time together sharing communion, okay? All right, let's get to the series. The series is called Out of the Rubble, brand new series that we'll start this weekend. Would you turn to the book of Nehemiah, please? We'll be in Nehemiah now for 7 weeks. Nehemiah is kind of hard to find. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther in there. It's after Chronicles, before Job and Psalms, kind of in the middle of your Old Testament, the book Nehemiah. And we're going to be in chapter 1 and a bit of chapter 2 today. The series is called Out of the Rubble, and that rubble is representative. It's metaphorical. It's symbolic of, the kind of stuff that's broken in our lives. So sin and its consequences, maybe some mistreatment that you've experienced, some circumstances that are beyond your control, perhaps injustices, some things that you observe about life that you go, that just ain't right. And those are the kind of the rubble things that we're talking about. And here's the good thing is that out of rubble, greatness and godliness rises. And I'm just going to challenge all of us all the way through this, that you, like Nehemiah, can actually do something about the stuff that created the rubble. And so it might as well be you doing it. Now, I've got some good news. So if you are smart, you've got a good intellect, you are attractive and popular, and maybe you are like a cheerleader or a star athlete or something like that. Hey, don't be discouraged by that, okay? Just want you to know God can even use you, all right? What God does is he works with really normal people and does phenomenal things with them. My mom feels that there is probably a genius gene in her side of the family. Now, I know what you're thinking, but I don't have that genius gene. But my cousin Craig does, a bona fide genius. Got his undergraduate degree from Duke, got his law degree from Harvard, then got his PhD from Stanford in computer science. His doctoral dissertation was called a fully homomorphic encryption scheme. And that doesn't mean anything to anybody, but what you should know is that what he did there was groundbreaking. It has now launched him into the forefront internationally in the whole computer science world, because what he did in that dissertation is solved a 30-year problem that people had been trying to solve and couldn't. And it really has to do with cloud computing and encryption and being able to do equations in the cloud, which they didn't know how they were going to be able to do it without this type of encryption that he basically invented. And so, off the charts, brilliant, it's ridiculous. And I'm encouraged because God can even use people like my cousin Craig to do remarkable things for the kingdom. So you'll notice in your notes today the big idea that says God is looking for ordinary people like Nehemiah who will do extraordinary things, and it might as well be me. And when I say me, I don't mean me, I mean you. It might as well be you. Why not? Now, in fairness, was Nehemiah really an ordinary guy? Well, no and yes. No, in the sense that he was cupbearer to the king. So he was cupbearer to a Persian king. Now, Persian kings were regularly assassinated, and so it's kind of this, legend and fable and lore. But they literally had wine tasters, food tasters, because Persian kings were assassinated so much that they had to get all kinds of protection, and people would try to poison them with their food. And so, just like you've heard, it's literally a guy that would sip the wine before the king did. And if the guy dropped over dead, then the king opened a different bottle. I mean, you just stayed away from that, right? And this is what Nehemiah did. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was expendable. Because for Nehemiah to be that guy, he had to be well-trained in court etiquette. He had to be handsome. He had to know wine. He had a convivial disposition, able to lend an ear at all times to the king, sort of become a resource for him. The king trusted him. He had tremendous influence because he actually had impact on who would get to see the king. I'm actually intrigued by how much the king liked Nehemiah, which we will see as we go. But the king put Nehemiah in harm's way every single day, all day. You see, the fact, by the way, that Nehemiah was in such a position of influence suggests that he had impeccable character. I want to remind you today, and as we go through this, that God uses people of character. Don't think that God is going to select you for greatness in his kingdom unless you're doing the hard work of character development and working on purity and godliness and righteousness in your own life. No shortcuts here. So Nehemiah wasn't necessarily ordinary because of this prestige that he had in this interesting role, though kind of expendable. But Nehemiah was ordinary in that what he signed up for, as we will see, was way outside of his comfort zone, way outside of his area of expertise. Nehemiah was not a revolutionary. He wasn't a contractor. He wasn't a mason. He wasn't an elected official. He wasn't royalty. He wasn't even a proven leader. But he was a guy whose heart was gripped one day, and he rose up and said, that ain't right. And somebody's got to do something. And it might as well be me. And so let's take a look at the problem that gripped him. Verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. All right, the king is Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes had a nickname. They called him Longimanus, which means long-handed. And the reason they called him that is actually because his right hand was longer than his left hand. Now, you know what that means, don't you? Yeah, you had to buy 2 pairs of gloves every time you went to get gloves, right? A large and a medium, which... At any rate, I don't want you to remember today, if you're remembering one thing, it's not that his name was Longimanus because his right hand was longer than his left. Very odd, just trivia, making sure that you're with me. Artaxerxes' father was assassinated in his bedroom. Artaxerxes killed his own brothers to ensure that he got the throne. Persian kings had tons of enemies, which is why Nehemiah was the cupbearer. Verse 2, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Trouble and disgrace, misery, calamity, contempt, and scorn. Why? Because the walls of the city are in rubble and the gates have been burned with fire. Now, we need some historical context to understand what's going on here. So, here's what we know. The Bible says very clearly that God blesses obedience and he punishes disobedience. He's still doing that, but he was very clear to Israel about this. Now, the punishment that he told them would happen is that they would be exiled, that Jerusalem would fall, that the country would fall, that they would give in to some marauders, and they would be exiled. And that's exactly what happened because Israel got into idolatry and disobedience. They stopped tithing, they got greedy, and God had had enough. And so there was a couple of waves of judgment. One of those happened in 586 BC, before Christ. The southern kingdom, which is called Judah, that has a capital city called Jerusalem, was conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in 586. The temple was knocked over completely, and so were the city walls. They also devastated the countryside, killed the leaders and priests, carted off many of the Jews to Babylon. Only the poorest and the weakest were allowed to stay in Judah, thereby, diminishing the gene pool. This was a big deal now when the walls went down. Frankly, I have trouble coming up with a comparative example for us. The temple was a place of worship. It was the center of culture. This was a terrible thing when it goes down. The walls were there for protection. You know how this goes. In an ancient city, your best protection was your walls. And so when the walls are down, now you're vulnerable to your enemies. But the other thing that happens is kind of psychological. Their identity goes down with those walls. Their dignity goes down with those walls. There's embarrassment in the whole nation because the walls are down. The equivalent that I can come up with is this, is that when I think about the Oasis, this water park that we're building for our community, like one of my fears, a fear that's kind of like a sliver in me that keeps me praying is that we run out of money and we actually can't finish the project. And it's an abhorrent thought to me that that thing would just sit there like half done, a cement hole and a dilapidated building. That would be embarrassing. And our critics, of which there are many, would go, see, they couldn't pull it off. And those that wonder if God even exists would go, see, there is no God, or it's not a God that cares, or at least it's not a God that cares about them. That our credibility would be hurt, that God's credibility would be hurt, that the kingdom would take a hit because we didn't finish the project. It's kind of like that, where they look at the walls of Jerusalem down on the ground, and it's just a mockery of God's character and God's people. Now, why didn't they fix it? Well, maybe apathy, disobedience, rebellion, fear, lack of leadership, a defeatist attitude. We know that the people there were faced with some ill treatment and some forced labor, but they, could have got the walls going again, but they just didn't. Well, then 47 years later, a very important thing happens, and that is the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. Medes and Persians, okay, the Persians conquer Babylon. Now, the Persian kings had a different foreign policy than the Babylonian kings. The Persian kings allowed the exiles to return to their homeland, and so they began to return. The first group returned in 538 under Zerubbabel, and they actually rebuilt the temple. They got that done in 515. So the temple's rebuilt, good. We got the place of worship fixed. Then a second group returns 80 years later under Ezra. Now, Ezra and his crew found the place to be an absolute moral mess. Now, they tried to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and King Artaxerxes actually had some fear about whether or not they'd become too strong, and so he shut down the rebuilding efforts. Then there was a third group, and that's our group. This is Nehemiah's group. They returned in 445 BC. 140 years after the temple and the city walls were first reduced to rubble. 140 years later, Nehemiah's brother rolls in on a visit from Judah, and Nehemiah gets the word that it's still a mess. And what God is going to do is use an ordinary guy named Nehemiah to do an extraordinary thing. To travel about 1,000 miles to Jerusalem where he's actually never been. And under tremendous strain and obstacle and opposition, he is going to lead a rebuilding effort and rebuild the walls and the gates of Jerusalem, and he's going to knock it out in 52 days. They've been down for 140 years. 52 days. It's because a guy rose up and said, well, it might as well be me. It might as well be me. What kind of people does God use to do these kinds of extraordinary things? Well, I discover three primary characteristics, and so we will look at them now. Verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. The first thing that a person does that God uses to do extraordinary things is sit down and weep. Sit down and weep. Now, sitting down was a customary position of mourning. If you think of Job, for instance, he sat on a mat and mourned. But why was Nehemiah so distressed? Why was Nehemiah so distressed about something that happened 140 years earlier? He wasn't even alive when it went down. Why is he distressed? Well, I'll tell you this. He's not distressed because the walls are down. He already knew that the walls were down. I think he's distressed because nobody had done anything about it. He is sad, he is mad, and he is sad and he's mad at his people because they are in Jerusalem while he is wilting in the desert heat at the beck and call of a king that can kill him at a moment's notice. He'd give anything to change places with them, but there he is stuck in Susa while they are right there in Jerusalem and could fix the problem and rebuild the walls. He is sad. They are in Jerusalem. He's in Susa. but apparently they are apathetic or afraid or defeated, but this is a problem, and the distress of it is moving him to action. He is experiencing what Bill Hybels calls a holy discontent. It's a great term, a holy discontent. Hybels talked about this at a leadership summit a few years ago, then wrote a book about it. The idea of a holy discontent is there's something going on in life, something in your life, something happening around you, and when you look at it, when you see it, you go, wait, that just ain't right. Like, that should not be happening. That should not be allowed to go on. Somebody needs to do something. This is a holy discontent. Now, Hybels, very humorous, likens it to the cartoon Popeye, right? Remember Popeye? It was a while ago. Popeye was what kind of man? A sailor man. And Popeye had a rather plain girlfriend. Her name was Olive Oil. And he also had an enemy. He had a nemesis. What was his name? Yeah, isn't it Bluto? Bluto. Now, what would happen is in every episode is Bluto would be up to some no good, and usually it was about trying to steal olive oil, not sure why, but it was something around all of that. And Popeye would get, he kind of let it go, and then he'd kind of get to the point where he'd had enough. And he would squeeze a can of what? Spinach. Can't believe I'm not better. He's eating his vegetables. He would eat his spinach and he'd get really strong, and he had inordinately large forearms. Remember, his biceps were kind of small and really, really big forearms. And so at the moment when he was about to snap, he had a saying. Do you remember it? I'll say the first part and then you'll fill it in. That's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. Remember? Well, maybe you don't, because it really sounded like this. That's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. So you need to say it like that. Ready with me? 1, 2, 3. That's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. That's a lot better. Okay? That's the holy discontent, where someone goes, that's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. I'm going to do something about this. It's a holy discontent that happens when a guy opens his newspaper, sits down on his hearth, and he sees the headline again, the Heights pool has been defeated, and he goes, that's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. God wants our church to do something about it. That's a holy discontent. It's what happens when a guy sees a little girl about 5 years old in a yellow dress. It was a pretty dress, but very tattered, making her bed on the street with just a ratty little blanket, laying down on the street, holding her little doll, hugging herself to sleep, while people walk by. And he says, that's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. 5 million orphans in Ethiopia is not okay. Widows without roofs over their head is not okay. That's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. We're going to do something. It's why there's a team in Ethiopia right now. This is holy discontent kind of stuff. This is what Nehemiah was experiencing. And let me say this to you, that if you are seeing it happen around you and you are not feeling it, then you are not seeing it the way God sees it. If you see the problem, but you don't feel the problem, it's time that you start asking God to break your heart for the things that break His. It's time for you to start asking God to help you see people the way He sees people. And once you start feeling it, that's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. What do? Look at verse 4 again. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. You first sit down and weep, and then what do? You kneel down and you pray. You kneel down and you start praying. I'd like us to take a look at the prayer of Nehemiah. It's instructive. It's a good pattern. Here we go, verse 5. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Notice that he starts with worship and praise. That's the way lots of us start our prayers. Verse 6, let your ears be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess this. So what he's starting with there is he's going, God, please hear me on this. And then he says it, I confess the sins. Look at the pronoun, we Israelites, including myself and my father's house have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly towards you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. He confesses sin. You see, Nehemiah is a great leader because he does not play the blame game. He just owns it. He just owns his own sin right along with his fellow Jews. Ezra did this, by the way. Daniel did the same thing. Just owning it. Not playing the blame game. A lot of you know about a book named Good to Great, written by a guy named Jim Collins about business. And what he does is he compares some companies that did really, really well, that went from good to great, and then some comparison companies that were in the same market, same industry, that did not exceed and excel in the way that the great company did. And so what he's doing is investigating, why did the great company become great when the other company, which was in the same market, didn't? And he lists a variety of things through this book. One of those is the leader, the CEO, and he has a term, it's called level 5 leaders. He says these companies, these great companies, have level 5 leaders, and he expounds on what a level 5 leader is. But one of the dynamics of a level 5 leader is what he calls the window and the mirror. The window and the mirror. What he asserts is that when things are going really well, a level 5 leader, okay, window and mirror, they're both glass. When things are going well, the level 5 leader looks out the window to see why things are going well and who would get the credit for that. What are the dynamics in the market? What's the systems that we have, the employees that we have? Who gets the credit for this? The level 5 leader, when things are going poorly, doesn't look out the window, he looks in the mirror and says, okay, where am I the problem? What do I need to do differently? How can I fix this? How do I need to change? What Collins found is interesting in the comparison companies that those leaders were just the opposite. When things were going poorly, they'd look out the window to see who to blame. And when things were going well, they'd look in the mirror and preen. Nehemiah was a level 5 leader. Nehemiah just looked in the mirror and said, sorry, Lord, for my contribution to the mess that we are in. Just confess the sin. And then in verse 8, he says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the nations. That's what happened. They're scattered. They're all the way over in Persia. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people were at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. He's acknowledging that God has a right to have them be defeated and exiled, and acknowledging that God's going to forgive and restore if they come back. Verse 10, they are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. God will forgive and restore if there is repentance. And by the way, he's still doing it. Like you might even feel a bit exiled from God these days. He didn't leave, you did. But what he does is he promises to bring you back if you repent, if you stop, turn, go the other way, confess your sins. And by the way, we're taking communion today, which makes a tremendous opportunity for you to do some of that with him today again. Verse 11, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. There are some of us that are still following you, God. Hear our prayer, and here it is. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, the king. Now, what I want you to notice here is that the primary purpose of his prayer, the primary focus of his prayer, the primary reason he prayed, the primary request is for what? success. It's for success. What I want you to note is that he did not pray for faithfulness. See, for those in the room that have been around Christianity for a bit, you know this saying that we have. We put it on coffee cups and plaques and stuff like that says, God has not called me to be successful. He's called me to be faithful. It's not in the Bible. The quote is attributed to who, by the way? Mother Teresa. Lots of respect for Mother Teresa. It's just that what she said isn't really biblical. He prays for success. For some reason in Christianity, we kind of have this aversion to success. We sort of have this aversion to talking about success or even striving for success. One time, I had the opportunity to sit on the stage with Rebecca St. James at one of her concerts and interview her in front of the audience. One of the questions I asked her was about her success, and when I said the word, she physically recoiled, had an aversion to the concept of success. I felt really bad for her. Because to be honest with you, we want Rebecca St. James to be a success. Like, right, we don't want her to make crappy music. Like, we want to go to a concert and enjoy good music. We want her to be successful at it. We don't want her to just be faithful at making good music or making music. We want her to make good music, to be successful at it. Look, if you're going to do something that's coming about out of your holy discontent, I'm telling you, we don't want you to be faithful at it. We need you to be successful at it. Now, we all know that you're not going to be successful unless you're also faithful. But the ultimate goal isn't faithfulness. The ultimate goal is that we get this problem fixed. We need you to be successful. And so Nehemiah right here is our model, unapologetically prays for success. You sit down and mourn. There's a problem here. And then you kneel down and you pray hard and you pray for success. And then what do? You stand up. You stand up and do something. Now, it's going to be costly and it's going to be risky and it's going to be scary, but if it's not you, then who's it going to be? And Nehemiah said, well, it might as well be me. So here's what he does. Verse 1, chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So it's 4 months later, okay? So he prayed and fasted for 4 months. And then one day he is distressed. And so verse 2, this king asked me, why does your face look sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. Why was he afraid? This is actually a very dicey moment. See, anyone in a Persian king's court was expected to be cheerful. You had to be cheerful around him at all times because you didn't want to, diminish the vibe in the court. You didn't want to be grumpy or depressed. Everything's going to be cheerful around the king. Archaeologists, by the way, have uncovered reliefs, like paintings, indicating that a person actually put their hand over their mouth when they approached a Persian king so that the king would not smell your breath. This is the environment in which Nehemiah worked. You see, Nehemiah is sad. And Nehemiah is now afraid because this king, Artaxerxes, expects him to be cheerful, but also this king is the king who gave the cease and desist order on the previous wall rebuilding effort. He's the one that made the law. See, the idea that Artaxerxes would reverse a previous ruling is ludicrous. And Nehemiah, being a servant in the king's court, knows how this works. There's actually a modern day saying that goes something like this, well, don't try to change it, because it's like the laws of the Medes and the Persians. It literally means, don't try to change it because you're not going to get it changed. It's impossible to get it changed. It's why, by the way, Daniel got thrown in the lion's den. Remember that? It's because there was a law that was made that was then binding and the king couldn't change it, and so Daniel got thrown in the lion's den. So what Nehemiah is doing now is coming in sad, and he's hoping that the king is going to change his law. Come on. How bold. So verse 3, dicey moment. King says, what's going on? And he starts by buttering up the king. May the king live forever. It's a good start. May the king live forever. The world would be a better place if you were here forever, sir. But why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Think for a moment, Artaxerxes, if this happened to Susa, you'd be sad too. This is what he's appealing to. And so, remarkably, the king says, well, what do you want? And then look at this. Then I pray to the God of heaven. In the industry, we call this a flare prayer. It's a flare prayer that was sent up, but it was sent up on the foundation of a long season of intercession, 4 months of prayer and fasting. Flare prayers are easy, guys, but Nehemiah's flare prayer was launched off a foundation of deep and earnest intercession over a long time. And so now here's this key moment. And so he quickly is good. It's probably just kind of a God, be with me. Lord, help me. And he says, verse 5. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, if you have any affinity towards me at all, king, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. I'm asking you to reverse a previous decision. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, well, how long will your journey take and when will you be back? Ooh, there's a crack. He might be saying yes. He did. It pleased the king to send me. So I set a time. Now, me, I'd be like, yes, got it. And maybe stop. Look what he does. I also said, hey, if it pleases the king, may I also have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And while you're in a good mood, may I also have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and the residence that I'll occupy? I need some lumber. Can I have some of your wood? And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. You just love that, how he just goes for it? Jesus later, by the way, said, hey, you don't have because you don't ask. Like, don't say no for him. Everybody in sales knows this. Don't say no for him. Just ask. You don't have because you don't ask. So he's going, I'd like to rebuild the wall. I need safe passage through dangerous territory. I also need some lumber. Can I have some of your forest? And the king's impressed with Nehemiah's boldness. But really the main reason it happens is because of the gracious hand of God was on Nehemiah. God was saying yes to 4 months of prayer. And God's given Nehemiah some early success. So look at verse 9. It all starts happening. And he starts traveling actually between verse 8 and verse 9. So look at 9. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letter. And the king, look at this. The king had also sent army offers and a cavalry with me. He didn't ask for that one. Isn't that just the wondrous, bountiful, gracious hand of God in his life? Yep, you get to rebuild the walls. Here's safe passage. Anybody touches you, they're going to mess with me. Here's a whole bunch of lumber from my forest. Oh, and I'm sending the military to protect you, boy. Incredible. I mean, what a story already. So awesome, this early success. But Nehemiah does something very wise for us as he chronicles this. Because, guys, anytime that you are rising up, anytime you say, that's all I can stand, I can't stand no more, anytime that you are being used by God to accomplish something extraordinary, as awesome as it is, there's going to be opposition. And so look at this little foreshadowing, verse 10. Then when Sanballat the Oronite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. This is an ominous verse. It just kind of hangs out there and indicates there is trouble ahead. But today we just think about this incredible success that he is already having. Why is God giving Nehemiah such early and encouraging success? Well, because he asked for it. Certainly because he asked for it. But why is God using Nehemiah? I mean, is there anything about Nehemiah that could also be applied to you? Why Nehemiah? Well, what we know from the text is he's using Nehemiah because Nehemiah cared. He sat down and he wept. He had a holy discontent. That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more. Then he depended on God and he knelt down and he prayed. And then he went, you know what? It might as well be me. And still he stood up and he did something. See, God uses ordinary people to do incredible things under the blessing and the grace and the guidance and the power of God. A person one time came to President Roosevelt and said, Mr. Roosevelt, you're a great man. He responded by saying, nope, Teddy Roosevelt's simply a plain ordinary man, highly motivated. Ordinary guy, highly motivated. Nehemiah, plain, ordinary guy, highly motivated. This ain't right. Kevin McHale, Hall of Fame basketball player for the Boston Celtics, this week told Jim Rome to succeed in the NBA, and then he added, and in life, you need to outwork your talent. There's one to remember. You need to outwork your talent. I mean, if you're going to be great, there's a lot of talented people. The people that rise are the ones who outwork their talent. That's what Nehemiah did. This is the kind of person God uses to change the world. Ordinary people who care, who pray, and rise up and do something. This is how God works. It's always the way he works. Think about it. Where you see a desert dweller, God sees a 100-year boat builder. Where you see a dirty Bedouin, God sees the father of a nation that exists to this day. Where you see a murderous, washed-up shepherd, God sees a deliverer of his people from Egypt. Where you see a little shepherd boy, God sees a giant killer and a king. Where you see a donkey, God sees a spokesman. And where you see a timid queen, God sees a courageous deliverer. And where you see a prostitute, God sees a worshiper. And where you see a fisherman with a big mouth, God sees an apostle and a Bible writer and a martyr. And where you see a short, arrogant, murderous, bald guy, God sees the guy who would write most of the New Testament and completely revolutionize the world. And where you look in the mirror and see what you see, God sees someone who can do something extraordinary and literally change the world. God is still doing this. With whom is he doing it? Someone who sees the problem but then feels it. Feels what God feels. Someone who's highly motivated with a holy discontent. Somebody that says, that's all I can't stand no more, and hits his knees and begins to pray and pray hard and pray earnestly, and then that person stands up and does something. Somebody that is willing to outwork their talent. This is who God uses. Who's it going to be? Well, it might as well be you.